The federal and Ontario governments there today celebrating another major electric vehicle plant deal for the province. This time around, it's a $15 billion investment for a series of Honda plants that'll bring, the government say, 1,000 direct jobs to Alliston, Ontario. This one comes with $5 billion in federal and provincial incentives. Unlike the last two EV deals, the federal side is made up of tax credits, not subsidies. Does the announcement pack political punch for the two governments involved, or are they celebrating a cake that's only half-baked if EVs don't turn out to be as dominant a force as has been anticipated? Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. Former BC Premier Christy Clark is here. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Former Toronto Mayor John Tory is with us, as is former NDP leader Tom Mulcair. Hello, everybody. Great to see you. Christy, I'll start with you. We've talked more largely about the government's response to the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. This is kind of different in that it's through tax credits and it's not through massive production subsidies. Do you think that insulates them at all from any political pushback, or do you think this lands for them politically?
Well, I think most people are going to put this in context, which is it's kind of, if you add up all the government subsidies of one kind or another that have been going into the automotive industry in the last little while, it's about $43 billion, which is a lot of foregone revenue for Canadians, for sure. I do think, it's focused in Ontario and Quebec. Federal government really wants to get votes there. There's no doubt about it. They love having Doug Ford support them because, of course, Premier Ford is quite popular with the base of people whose votes that they need in Ontario. And, so it's politically, I guess, pretty smart to do it. But boy, there'll be a lot of Canadians in Atlantic Canada, certainly in Western Canada, where the federal government's policies seem designed to put them out of a job, wondering why the federal government isn't, deregulating, making the burden a little bit lighter in Western Canada so that the private sector can create jobs without subsidies, and then seeing their tax dollars going into other parts of the country in huge, huge numbers because the government's economic policy isn't good enough to create jobs without subsidies.
I think part of it, and sort of in a wider context, Tom, is the idea that they're picking winners. That essentially, and they feel there's a justification for it, and there may also be a political layer, as Christy spoke about, to why they're picking the winners they are. But ultimately, they are picking winners. Do you think that is helpful to them, or is there a risk associated with that?
Well, clearly this deal has been in the works for some time, but it really does come at a great moment for Mr. Trudeau, because last week's budget, as we've all seen, landed with a bit of a thud. And so now he gets to stand there, deliver some very powerful lines about being positive and looking to the future, and even gets in a little dig by talking about how good it is to work with a progressive conservative leader. I think that most of the people in Ontario and in Quebec who have benefited from this, and I would dare say many people across the country are saying, you know what, the auto sector has always been crucial. We're upping our game. You're very smart, I think, Vassy, to include that caveat, because we're not sure what the electric vehicle market's going to be. But I think it's going to be positive for the years to come. And I think that they're doing their best to make sure that Canada is going to be part of that great transformation with regard to electric vehicles. So I think overall it's a winner. And I would dare say, especially with the younger crowd that Trudeau has been trying to court, it didn't work with the budget. But a lot of younger people are going to say, that's what we've been waiting for, something solid and important on the environment. And I think that Trudeau managed to deliver something very substantial today.
Both Tom and Christy alluded to the fact that this was an announcement John made in tandem. We played some of the clips there, but it was the Premier and the Prime Minister with all their various ministers talking about how great it is to work with one another. The carbon tax debate of last week shifted to the side. Why do you think they feel it's within their both of them feel it's in their self-interest to do so?
Because it's about the one thing that we've talked about here on this panel, which is if the economy doesn't, recover and get stronger going forward and present the opportunities for young people and others to have a prosperous life here in Canada, then all of these governments are going to be in trouble, including Mr. Ford's. And so it's about jobs. And let's talk. I mean, yes, every investment that is made by government or the private sector, and I prefer generally for private sector people to make those choices, is a risk. There's always a risk. There's a risk when a private sector company or person makes an investment. But let's remember here that for whatever the government's put in by way of tax credits and money, Honda a respected, successful global corporation has made an even bigger bet on Ontario and on Canada. And I look at these things, and I'm one of those people who believes that when we invest in a pipeline under different history and circumstances, I admit, in Western Canada or the aerospace industry in Quebec, or invest, for that matter, by making an exception, which is very controversial, in the well-being of Atlantic Canadians under the carbon tax you mentioned, that's good for Canada, or at least one hopes it is. That's the idea. It's to build the whole country. And the automotive industry, going back to Mr. Trudeau Sr., has had a history of being an area where the governments could partner to create and then maintain, and it's gone through evolutions, thousands of jobs, and the spin-off jobs too. And so it's a good news story, and it's why they're standing there very proudly together, because everybody wins out of it, including the thousands of people who will work in these plants, maybe more particularly.
Christy, what do you think about the possibility of risk? I think I totally get everything John's saying, but you're not, the number you threw it there, right? 40. It's not a small amount of taxpayer money. And yes, the companies are investing too, but if you go to the other two deals, the ratio is like 1 to 2. Honda's ratio is much stronger for sure.
There is no doubt about that. And, you know, I mean, government supporting investment isn't a terrible thing. I'm not opposed to that. I do think there are two issues here, though. One is the underlying weakness of the government's economic strategy means that they have to give out massive subsidies, much bigger than they otherwise would if they had a strong tax policy, a strong regulatory environment, and were able to attract foreign investment without all the sweeteners. The second part, though, is a long-running issue for people who live outside of central Canada, which is where, you know, a lot of all of our tax money goes into supporting this kind of job creation in the auto sector, at the same time that the federal government is bringing in what are essentially production caps on oil and gas and the energy producing industries in the West. I mean, I don't think Westerners are asking for subsidies. They're just asking for the federal government to not try and stop them from actually having jobs. And that differential, I think, creates a real tension for Canadian unity. And, you know, I think it's probably a greater problem today than it has been for a long time.
And I do get that sentiment, Tom. I just got back from Edmonton. It is very, very real, what Christy describes. The only sort of anecdote or caveat I would add is they did just spend $34 billion on a pipeline that's going to add 0.5% to our country's GDP. And although the production caps, I'd get that argument as well, like it's going to help get that oil out of that province.
Yeah, and there are lots of new technologies that are indeed coming online. And I think that shouldn't be diminished in terms of its importance. Canada is a leader with carbon capture and storage, which was dismissed by a lot of people in my field of environment and sustainable development out of hand without even looking at the evidence. But there's more and more evidence that there are things that can be done. And Canada can help get ahead of that, so we would be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time continue to be prosperous in our resource-based economy. We're blessed to have the resources we have, but we haven't done a very good job of rolling them out in any sort of rational way. You're right also, I think, Vassy, to remind Canadians, as John just did before, that the federal government just put in this massive public investment of $34 billion and counting to build, to rebuild what was the Kinder Morgan pipeline, now called Trans Mountain, to get more of the production out of the oil sands to the Pacific coast. It's actually controversial in Christie's province because, of course, not everybody wanted to see the tankers coming in to Burrard Inlet. But I think overall Canadians understand you do have to make that extra effort. Every province has its deals, and this, I think, is one that conserves that core manufacturing capability in central Canada, which is where it's been, and absolutely will benefit from the whole thing across the country as we see this thing roll out. I think that all Canadians will look at this as something positive.
We shall see. We'll be talking about this for a while, I think. I'm going to take a quick break. The front bench is sticking around.